Garland's silence around the Trump investigation. The dancing Itos were a lesser pop culture legacy of the O.J. Simpson case. Jay Leno's Tonight Show featured a ragged chorus line of black-robed hoofers meant to resemble Judge Lance Ito, who was presiding over the trial, as well as a look-alike for Marcia Clark, the lead prosecutor. It was a, sort of, funny send-up of the way those connected to the double murder trial had suddenly become famous. The skit lasted less than a couple of minutes, and it's been largely forgotten, except by the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland. When I interviewed Mr. Garland last year about the Oklahoma City bombing, it was the first thing he mentioned. The bombing took place on April 19, 1995, at a time when the former football star's criminal trial, which had begun that January, was a national obsession. This undignified spectacle served as a photo negative of how Mr. Garland wanted the bombing case to unfold, and decades later he was still repelled. The dancing Itos, he told me. That was exactly what we wanted to avoid. At the time of the bombing, Mr. Garland was 42 years old, and his official title was Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General, pronounced PDAG, in Justice Department argot, which hardly did justice to his importance in the department. About 2 days after the bombing, Janet Reno, the Attorney General, grew concerned that turf battles were hampering the investigation, so she told Jamie Gorelick, the Deputy Attorney General, to get someone on the ground in Oklahoma City to take charge. Ms. Gorelick sent Mr. Garland, whose experience on the case would shape the rest of his career, including his most important current duty, directing the investigation of Donald Trump. Mr. Garland appears to see the courtroom, and the law, as an almost sacred refuge from the tumult of modern life. The law, he believes, must be protected from not just the vulgarities of show business but also the passions of politics. This is why he has proceeded with such caution in the Trump investigation and especially why he has said so little about it in public. There is much to be commended in this kind of reticence, because it projects fairness and even-handedness. But there is a cost, too, in Mr. Garland's approach. As Attorney General, Mr. Garland is responsible not just for bringing cases but also for warning the public of ongoing threats, including from political actors like Mr. Trump and his allies. The question is whether Mr. Garland's silence protects the law but also misses the chance to defend democracy. On his first day in Oklahoma City, Mr. Garland represented the government at Timothy McVeigh's arraignment. I sat across the table from killers, Mr. Garland told me, recalling his years as an assistant U.S. attorney. But I had never seen such a stone-cold face. Later that night, Mr. Garland visited the bombing site, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, which was still illuminated by massive lights to aid in the search for survivors. When he arrived, there were tiny broken toys and ripped little backpacks visible in the debris. The final death toll would be 168, including 15 of the 21 children in the daycare center on the second floor. Mr. Garland and his wife had 2 daughters who were close in age to the kids who had perished. Mr. Garland took control of the legal side of the case the next morning. The Simpson case was fresh in his mind. In that unfolding drama, the defense had pointed to a series of blunders by the Los Angeles police and prosecutors. The issue of law enforcement incompetence and misconduct was much in the air, and Mr. Garland knew that the public, and prospective jurors, would be watching the bombing case through that filter. He didn't want agents to take any chances that a judge might later find their searches unlawful and suppress the evidence they discovered. So he set up shop processing search warrants for nearly every step the agents took in the investigation. It was tedious and perhaps unnecessary, but Mr. Garland made sure that the proprieties were observed. The pattern was set for the rest of the investigation, and the rest of Mr. Garland's career, painstaking work behind the scenes and extreme rhetorical restraint in public. A few days after he arrived in Oklahoma, Mr. Garland served as prosecutor in Mr. McVeigh's bail hearing. In light of the seriousness of the charges, there was no chance Mr. McVeigh was going to be released, but Mr. Garland went out of his way to speak about the case in an almost willfully boring way. "You have heard evidence, Your Honor," he said in court, "more than sufficient to establish that during and in relation to a crime of violence the defendant used and carried a destructive device, that is, a bomb. On the issue of bail, he said, "Your Honor, as everyone knows, he faces the possibility of the death penalty, in this case an enormous incentive to flee. The government represents no condition would prevent a person in that situation from fleeing." Mr. Garland became so invested in the bombing case that he weighed asking Ms. Gorelick for the chance to remain as lead courtroom prosecutor. But his boss had other plans, because the Unabomber investigation was floundering. Starting in 1978, a series of bombs had been mailed to various university and airline targets around the country. From 1987 to 1993, the bombing ceased, but then they started up again, including one that killed a Sacramento man on April 24, 1995, 5 days after the Oklahoma City bombing. The Justice Department was embarrassed by its failure to catch the mysterious perpetrator, and Ms. Gorelick told Mr. Garland to take over, which he did. Ted Kaczynski was arrested for the bombings in his tiny cabin in Montana on April 3, 1996. For the trials of Mr. McVeigh and Terry Nichols in the Oklahoma City bombing, Mr. Garland helped select a prosecution team led by Joseph Hartzler and Larry Mackey, who never became as famous as the O.J. prosecutors but who won convictions in court. Mr. McVeigh was executed in 2001, Mr. Nichols is serving life without parole. Mr. Garland received a splendid consolation prize for losing out on the trials. In September 1995, President Bill Clinton nominated him to a seat on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, the second most important court in the country, though he was not confirmed until March 1997. Mr. Garland's tenure as a judge reinforced the tendencies he established in the bombing investigation, meticulous about assembling facts and reluctant about expressing views. The cost of Merrick Garland's silence around the Trump investigation. The Dancing Itos were a lesser pop culture legacy of the O.J. Simpson case. Jay Leno's Tonight Show featured a ragged chorus line of black-robed hoofers meant to resemble Judge Lance Ito, who was presiding over the trial, as well as a look-alike for Marcia Clark, the lead prosecutor. It was a, sort of, funny send-up of the way those connected to the double murder